The other important thing we had today was responsive design, and I started off saying that media queries in regular CSS are one way to basically query the device, check what kind of size it has, what kind of media type it is, and then depending on that, adapt your layout and your style. The way this looks like is that you have the add media tag in CSS. Then you can define the media type. So is it a screen or is it a printout? And then you can define size constraints. So here you can, for example, say that the following CSS code should only be valid whenever the width is smaller or equal to 400 pixel. What happens in this case is that maybe somewhere I have an element with class my unimportant div. So I have some kind of div tag that is maybe not so important. So when the size is too small, I'll just display none. I'll basically make it invisible. And I can show this here in the code first. I basically did an example which looks a bit weird, but it has 3 different media queries. So there's one that says this one is only valid if the screen is smaller equals to 400 pixel. And that's exactly the example from the slide. I take the element with class my unimportant div and set display to none. And if we go down in the code, we'll see there's basically one div that has this ID. And it says I will disappear if the screen gets too small. So if I make my screen smaller, my browser window to 400 pixel, it will disappear. And then I defined 2 more. I defined one with maximum width 600 and one with minimum width 601. You could also maybe skip this and just say if it's larger. But essentially, I set 2 different background pictures. So whenever the screen is smaller than 600, I set the cat picture, and otherwise I'll take the dog hedgehog picture. So this is basically what I'll do. This directly shows that you can combine them in different ways. It doesn't mean that there always have to be 2 options, but you can basically set different parameters and change your layout. If we look at how this looks, this is my beautiful website. So I have my background picture. I have this div. I made it red so you can see it. And now I start scrolling. And the first thing that happens is when I get under 600 pixels, then my background should change. So now suddenly there's the cat. If I scroll back, it changes back. So this is just by using CSS I can do this. And then if I scroll further, the red box will at some point disappear. So now it's gone. Now I've decided that the screen is too small. I shouldn't have too much stuff. So I'll basically set display to none. So this is a very basic way of defining media queries to adapt your website to the screen. And this is great. You can do a lot with that, but it's still rather complicated. So one thing that is quite common is to actually divide the page into a grid. So you say that a typical thing is saying I have 12 columns, I have 10 columns, or so on. And then simply for each element, for an image, for example, say this image is 4 columns wide. And the good thing with that is that if you set the grid size properly, then it's adjusted whenever the screen changes. So one way to do that is to set 2 classes. So here I've basically defined a class col3, basically a column that is 3 units wide, 3 grids basically, and a column that is 9 wide. And I simply said, okay, the one with 3 is 25% of the screen, the other one is 75. And since it's a class, I can basically assign this to every element. I can have a div and say, this div is 3 columns wide, whereas this one is 9 wide. And if we look at that example, again, we can look first at the code. This is exactly what I have on the slides. I have these 2 columns and I have 2 divs. I also added a border just so that you see it properly. But if I now go into my example, you basically see the red box here is the complete 100%. That's the complete size of my browser window. And I have one that is 25% wide, one that is 75. And when I rescale, it basically adapts this automatically. And you see that it doesn't really care how small it gets. So now it starts looking a bit stupid, but this is part of it. So this is how you can define some kind of responsive design with a grid layout. So these are things that you can do with just CSS. And then we went a little bit into Bootstrap, which is essentially a framework to do responsive design and generally a framework to make things look nice. So it's basically a huge CSS file with lots of definitions and well tested and thought through. And it also has some JavaScript for example, animations, some interactivity. And what it does is it defines lots of classes that you can combine in any way you want. And the look and feel is rather familiar because lots of websites uses it. So originally it comes from Twitter, but lots of pages use Bootstrap, so it's not unfamiliar to most users. In this course, we will basically use Bootstrap 4 and we'll use the CSS parts because that interacts best with Vue.js, which we'll use as a front-end template framework. If we look at how to include Bootstrap, I have these references here, but I'll simply show them in a file. I think that makes more sense. So the basic Bootstrap include is just the CSS file. And then there are some additional things if you want to use the JavaScript. So then you additionally need to include, for example, jQuery, which is another JavaScript framework, and the Bootstrap JavaScript library. So you have, if you look at example 11, which I uploaded on Google, then you will also have access to the imports. Now, this is how you include it. That's not so relevant for now, but the basic thing in Bootstrap is that Bootstrap also defines a 12-column grid, so similar to the example I just gave for CSS. And whenever you have divs or other elements that you want scale, you can simply add them to the class, saying basically how wide they are. So this element here, this div, is 4 columns wide. This one is 8 wide. And the idea is that you basically define rows, divs of rows, and within those rows you have elements that add up to 12. So you should have 12 columns in the end. And if we look at that shortly, you will see that this is basically what I've done earlier. I have 2 columns here. One is 4, one is 8 wide, so you can roughly guess that this is half the size of this. And whenever I resize the browser window, the size resizes as well of the column. So this is essentially the same that I had in CSS. Now, the good thing is that Bootstrap also has some support for responsive design additionally that allows you to change the behavior depending on the size. So this is a little bit to the, similar to the media queries, that you have these -SM, -MD, -LG, and -XL extensions, and those are supposed to address different screen sizes, so small, medium, large, XL screen sizes that are here in the brackets. And you can add them to a lot of elements. So they are full lists online for what they work. But for example, if you do the column thing, we can go back to the code. I can essentially define the same as here, but instead of just saying col -4, I say col -SM -4, and then SM -8. And this means that the behavior is the same as before. I have one column that is 4 wide and one that is 8 wide. But the difference is that when it gets small, and small here means smaller than 576, then the column grid will basically be changed, and they will no longer be next to each other, but they suddenly will be under each other. So I can demonstrate that in the code. Now I have both cases. Up here I have the 2 columns that are just next to each other, and here I have the SM columns that will adapt. So if I now zoom, the behavior is the same until I reach a certain size. So when I get under 576, suddenly you see that the right box, this one, ends up under the other one. So this is basically a responsive behavior that doesn't always only scale, but at some point it also wraps around and it positions elements differently. So this is a great way of having some kind of responsivity in your design. Okay, and the final part of this I will go very quickly through, but there are different elements that you can add to Bootstrap to make it look nice. So for example, this kind of Jumbotron, which is basically a large box that gives some kind of important information. You get that by just adding Jumbotron as a class to a div. Or you can have a table with lots of different styles. For example, here you have this alternating striped table, which you get just by adding these 2 classes to an HTML table, and so on. So you get different colors, you get alerts, and I all have them bundled here in one file. If you go into file 11, you'll see the Jumbotron box, you see the table, you see some kind of alerts, and you see some buttons. And that's exactly what you'll see here. So up here, the gray thing is the Jumbotron. This here is a small table with a stripe design. There are lots of different designs available. Then you have these alerts with different colors. So you can have a success, which is light green, info, light blue, and so on. And down there you have buttons. And now there's one thing I talked a little bit in the beginning about, that Bootstrap is basically CSS, but it has some JavaScript functionality. And one example of that is a dismissible alert. So here you have an alert, it looks the same as above, but you also have this button that makes it disappear. So if I click on this, you'll see it nicely fades away and disappears. And for this you need JavaScript. So if I look into the code, you'll see that this is the regular alert, alert danger. And here I additionally added dismissible. This means you can close it. And then also fade, that it actually fades away and not just disappears. And these are things that require JavaScript. And then I've added the button that actually makes it disappear. So if I remove the JavaScript dependencies here and I reload the page, then you will see it's still there, it still looks nice, but nothing happens if I click on it. So if you then really want to make it disappear, you will have to code that with JavaScript yourself. Okay. And this is basically a quick run through Bootstrap, but there are, if you look at the literature references, there are lots of things you can look up in the Bootstrap tutorial, for example. Just make sure you use Bootstrap 4, not 3.